Thank you, Rebecca. Good to see everyone. As we say, Moedim L'Simcha, these intermediary days between the beginning of Passover, our Seders or Seder that just concluded, and the arc of the days of Passover are a time of appointed joy, or times when we can either feel that joy organically or sometimes remind ourselves that feeling joy is a practice. So we're here to do that today. I start today with a brief story that I want to ask you to open your heart and welcome in, that might strike as a little bit odd for the beginning days of Passover, but I'm going to share it and then we'll unpack it together. The late French philosopher Raymond Aron was strolling through Paris with his wife Suzanne and their newborn daughter. It was a glorious morning in the 1930s. You can picture this scene, the whole city in the throes of spring, soaking up the sun, people making conversation in the shade of the trees or drinking coffee at pavement bistro tables. And Aaron spots his friend, Simone Weil, and she is convulsed with grief. And he says to her, "What's wrong?" And she says, "There is a strike in Shanghai." Her eyes are brimming with tears, and troops fired on the workers. So here she is, halfway around the globe, and she's in this beautiful spring setting, and her heart is convulsed with grief at the loss of life that's happening on the other side of the world. So for many of us, we may really identify with this grief because we hear about people in our country and people all over the world, some of whom we don't even know, suffering and dying, and our hearts break again and again. But while, even though she was regarded by some to being close to a saint, Jewish saint, I guess you could say, she was also described as one of those people who she couldn't abstract, couldn't take herself out from the torrent of suffering in which humanity in her lifetime and in our lifetime finds itself engulfed again and again. So we know intellectually that we would not be able to function if we were to experience the full emotional impact of every loss of life, every act of injustice around the world, as if it had befallen someone we knew, someone we loved in our immediate circle. And yet, we find ourselves living in a world where that's increasingly demanded of us today. We consider it often our duty to care about anything beyond the walls of our home. And certainly the way that information and news and visuals are delivered to us through social media and a constant stream of live, real-time information, that's the world that we live in, right? But it means that what we're being asked to do is to care about everything with maximum intensity, maximum investment, maximum emotion, and maximum mourning, I would say, at what we become aware of happening around the globe, not only in our backyard. So many people have written about this, that we live in this kind of time, which is called the attention economy, where we're kind of clocked on how we scroll, how many seconds, not even minutes, but seconds we spend on our particular page. And those are all fed back kind of into this media machine that produces even more content to get us to stay engaged for, more than 7 seconds into 14 seconds or 18 seconds. And so some of us end up living inside the news. And we feel like by doing that we're doing our duty, like we're being a good citizen, right? We're staying informed, we're caring, we're really feel like we're taking it in, and how can we turn our back on that? Because that's actually part of showing up and being and caring. So what I feel like I'm describing for me as I was experiencing this story and rereading it again is describing what it looks like when chesed, one of the values in our Jewish tradition, often translated as love, is kind of unchecked, right? So like when we are so consumed with love and caring that there's not anything else, right? What does that look like in our lives, and how can we handle or balance that? So, in this period of counting the Omer, a spiritual practice from the second night of Passover, tracing the spiritual journey to Shavuot, our Feast of Weeks, as it's called in English translation, when we trace the path from emerging into freedom through the Seder to accepting responsibility at Mount Sinai and what it means to take on the covenant of the Torah, to take on responsibility, to take on obligation in a realistic and loving way in our hearts. So as we trace this arc, this spiritual path over 49 days, 7 weeks, we have the Jewish mystical structure to guide us, both in each week of the path and each day in the path. So in this first week of counting the Omer, we are in the sphera, in the Jewish mystical sphere of chesed, of love, right? It's a time for grounding ourselves in what it means to be love-filled, not only for ourselves, but for the world, for those around us. But the Jewish mystical tradition also offers a daily refraction of that value. So while we percolate chesed this entire week and try to figure out how to show up in the most loving way in our own lives, today we also percolate the Jewish mystical sphere of gevura, which means strength. It means boundaries. And so what the Jewish mystical tradition is inviting us to do is to say, how do we hold chesed in our bodies and in our hearts while also refracting it through gevura, through saying, if we go through our life with chesed, unchecked, unbalanced, it's not sustainable. So how can we, on this second day of counting the Omer, balance both of these things together? So I want to thank Rachel for sharing the source sheet. And I'm going to, as I always do, I will read everything out loud on the source sheet for those people who don't have access to a screen share right now. As we look at this second day of the Omer and ask the question of how do we refract gevura, how do we introduce boundaries with our chesed, with our love, to be sustainable in the world? I loved this quote by Rabbi Malka Bina Klein, in which she said, Gevura sheba chesed, right? These sense of boundaries and strength that we refract through our weekly practice of chesed, of love, in the counting of the Omer in this first week. Boundaries within loving kindness is how she translates this. This boundaries within loving kindness offers an alternative to either resentment or guilt. It offers a path to reconnecting with joy and an open heart. Gevura sheba chesed is about fully honoring our own needs and feelings as we discern how to help others. So it's interesting, Rebecca and I were just talking as Rachel was setting up the text space today. We were talking about what are these pre-steps to what makes wise action possible. And so I feel like this quote from Rabbi Klein here is kind of saying, how do we balance these things as a path forward to figure out how to take action? So I want to offer this image by the Canadian author David Kane that might help us picture how gevura, how a sense of boundaries might be refracted through love. I'm going to read this quote out loud here from the source sheet. He says, imagine if all the available public concern for a given issue could be collected in a huge rain barrel and redistributed among fewer people. Instead of having 50 million people care seriously about an issue for all of 6 hours, you could distill that 300 million hours of public concern into, say, 3,000 people who make it a primary moral concern for a decade. We can't reallocate public concern like rain barrel water, but maybe each of us within ourselves can become a little more focused. Imagine if it was normal for each person to focus 10 times as deeply on one or two issues at a time, rather than taking on the emotional burden of dozens and feeling helpless about the state of the world. Again, this is a quote by the Canadian author David Kane. So when we're dealing with rain barrels full of tsuris, full of hardship, full of impossible circumstances, difficult loss, violence, the loss of life, the cruelty that we see in the world around us, all those things are demanding our love and our attention. That is our dilemma. But what Kane is suggesting here is that to bring a sense of gevura, to bring a sense of boundaries to bear on this dilemma, not so that we can abandon everyone or abscond responsibility, right? But so that we can kind of concentrate and say, what are the areas in this world where I can bring my special gifts to bear in a concentrated way on one or two areas, to draw that line of gevura so that our chesed becomes more concentrated, more transformative in the world. And I will close with this quote by one of my favorite thinkers these days, Oliver Burkeman, in his Meditation for Mortals. This is a book that he wrote that I highly recommend. He says, in an age of attention scarcity, the greatest act of good citizenship may be learning to withdraw your attention from everything except the battles you've chosen to fight. So the Gevura here on the second day of the Omer is, in some sense, can be a withdrawing so that our chesed becomes more distilled, more focused. And our meditation, and thank you to Rachel for sharing the screen, we can take that down. And of course, the source sheet is shared in the chat for anyone who wants to have access to that and the links, etc. But our meditation is an opportunity for us to imagine that rain barrel full of all the things in the world, all the people, all the situations that demand our chesed, in which our chesed, our love, our caring as human beings is drawn to everything that we feel, we perceive, we see, we hear, the pitter-patter, the hail, the snow that falls into that rain barrel. And in our sit today, to bring whatever anchor we can today. For some, it'll be our breath. For others, it may be a focal point in the room or a sound. Something that will provide some gevura, to provide some boundary and focus for us, to distill our chesed into a path forward that can emerge into action. And for each of us, that'll look different in whatever way our lives dictate, our hearts direct us to, our resources allow. But this is the invitation on this second day of the Omer, is to balance our chesed with gevura, to look into the rain barrel, to discern how we can be of most service in the world through the distillation of our chesed. So we'll sit for the next 10 minutes or so, and I'll bring us back together with the bell or with a nigun, a wordless melody, before we join together for Mourner's Kaddish. So thank you to Rebecca and to Rachel for holding this space. A lot of quiet there at the end. I was ringing a bell that I think people couldn't hear that. The words that I'll close with are the words of Rabbi Malka Bina Klein that we started with today, that our boundaries within loving kindness offers an alternative to either resentment or guilt. It offers a path to reconnecting with joy and an open heart. Gevurah Sheba Chesed is about fully honoring our own needs and feelings as we discern how to help others. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Susan, for that beautiful teaching and practice. And thank you to everyone for joining together today to practice in community. We close this sit now with an opportunity to recite the Mourner's Kaddish. So if anyone is honoring the anniversary of a loved one's passing or in a period of mourning, you're welcome to share their name in the chat. And you're also welcome to unmute yourself and rise in body or spirit as we recite the words of the Mourner's Kaddish together. Yitkadal, Yitkadal,
Rabba,
Amen.
Dibra, Eda, Kolbe, Yisrael, Agala,
Amen.
Amen. We offer
Kol Yisrael, Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Imru. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again for that beautiful teaching. And thank you again to everyone for your participation, practice. It's really such a gift to gather every day here. For anyone who is leaving now, we wish you good health and shalom. We hope to see you again tomorrow, the same time, in this Catholic time. And everyone is welcome to stay on here now for another 12 minutes or so to ask Rabbi Susan any questions about her teaching and practice today, or share your reflection on what came up for you in today's sit. And you can do that in the chat box. Just if you have a question, answer your question with the word question in all caps so that we can try to see it there. And Rabbi Susan, I can go ahead and get the conversation started. I so appreciated this teaching on the relationship between Chesed and Gevurah. And I think so often there's kind of a false dichotomy between loving kindness and boundaries, right? As if it's like either or, either we can be kind and sharing of our love, or we have to be like boundary. But actually, like how these qualities exist is really that they are kind of two sides of the same coin as far as what makes love actually possible for it to be given and to be received. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit more about that. Like how, in your experience, how do boundaries make the sharing of love more possible?
I was just having a conversation with someone in my family over the holidays about kind of taking the mid and long term eye or view toward a relationship, and what it means to kind of hold the difficulty of the moment or unmet needs of the moment, without knowing what things are going to look like in the future. So I feel like there's like a sitting with the discomfort. with the inadequacy of the moment, of the boundary, of not taking action on something over here or not becoming as emotionally invested in something over here, so that I'm creating this container that I both have faith in, but also can be really uncomfortable, because I'm giving something up. And it might be hard to see what I'm gaining in that moment. So I don't know. That's something that comes to mind for me, in light of that conversation yesterday.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah, I'm hearing, it's like the way that love flows in the moment. And of course, we want to feel that. We want to be open to giving and receiving that. And the boundaries are more like a container that over time can help direct the flow of that love. And it's, as you said, something to be present for the process of. Love is patient and things take time.
Maybe the boundaries, the container can change too, right? Like we know that from meditation or from other spiritual practices. So it's not meant to be that boundary is there forever and it's always going to look the same. But the idea of there being a boundary and creating a container for us to meditate or to manifest our best in the world or to carry out justice in the world, whatever it is really critical, I think.
Yeah. And I loved how in your meditation guidance, you were guiding us to notice the sound in a way. I felt like part of that Gabora, as if there's a way that, the present moment itself can kind of provide that container or that Gabora for us to access.
Yeah.
Because,
I was so thrilled to see that someone in the chat mentioned that they purchased a couple of books by Oliver Berkman. I've been so absorbed with his teaching. And by the way, he's the source of where I discovered the quote by the Canadian author David Kane. I discovered that in one of Oliver Berkman's books. But I've been so absorbed in his teaching that I actually had to go back and look at what I'd taught for IJS over the last 4 or 5 months, because I feel like I've been quoting him so much. But I continue to get a lot of strength and insight from what he teaches, and shares and quotes. So
great recommendation. Yeah. Just seeing people with strength act on our concerns and concerns. Cheryl says, I'm recalling a discussion about boundaries, how like the cells in our bodies, boundaries are permeable, flexible, discerning, which is another aspect of Gabora, selective with what passes in and out of the membranes. It's like what you were just saying about boundaries also being alive and changing. And here's a question from Karen. Karen says, I appreciate your message, Rabbi Susan, and at the same time, I do feel that as American Jews, we have a responsibility to stand up to the actions that are particularly relevant to us. The administration using the threat of anti-Semitism cynically and without our permission or support to punish people and institutions that we value, and their use of deportation to concentration camps. These are clearly our issues to speak to, but I don't see that happening in an organized way, and I am finding that frustrating and painful. Collective action on these topics can contain both chesed and gevurah. What are your thoughts of what we can do? It's a big one. Yeah. You're muted.
I have some leaf blowers in the background today. So yeah, I mentioned, Rebecca, that you and I were talking about this in another context, but this idea of what makes wise action possible. And of course, we are familiar with the critique that's often leveled against meditation, right? Like, are you going to stay in this place forever and not move into action? So no, the answer is no. This is to help us discern. And I think part of what's really interesting, Karen, about your comments and your question is we're talking about things that are, you mentioned, particularly relevant to us. And that is the challenge, is that the things that are particularly relevant to us are growing, right? That's the rain in the rain barrel. And then there's also the things that aren't relevant to us and could be or should be relevant to us, right? But that even makes the collective rain in the barrel even more voluminous, I would say, and challenging for us. I think that one of the things that this meditation has helped me think about is looking at all the areas in which I'm involved right now as a volunteer and in advocacy and in all kinds of different ways, and looking at it and saying, is there a way that I can distill some of this down? Maybe it means shedding some things in order to focus on things that are more concentrated right now and calling out for my presence, attention, advocacy, justice making in the world. So it's extremely difficult, Karen, when you look around and you're like, I want to take action. I can't find a collective and organized way in which to do this. It is not easy. But I also think we have to be strategic, both as individuals in what we choose to engage in and do in our advocacy and justice making, and also to find the organizations and the partners in which to do that, which is not easy. I'll tell you that one of the organizations I would like to learn more about, happy to put this in the chat. I heard about this recently, and I do not know, so this is not an endorsement. I'm just sharing with you this, this organization that I learned about called Braver Angels that does work around sharing space with different opinions with people. And this is, some people could say, well, Rabbi Leider, you're not saving lives with that, right? But like, I find that the polarization that we encounter in the American, communities that we're in, and also the Jewish communities that we're in, the assumptions that we make about each other are so polarizing that we can't take action. We can't even often share the same space. So, that's a long response, Karen, to your thoughtful post, but those are some of my thinking, my thoughts on it.
So much. What's the other question? Natasha is asking, in Haggadah I bought this year called The Night That Unites. There's a reading about Jewish time from Rabbi Soloveitchik in which he stresses our need to master time, which he calls time awareness. He says we need retrospection for the past, anticipation for the future, and appreciation for the present. Fit with what you're teaching about time.
Wow, thank you, Natasha, for asking that. I would say kind of. I'm a huge. I don't know which Rabbi Soloveitchik this is because there's several wonderful teachers, but I'm a big fan of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but I'm not such a fan of the idea of mastering time because I actually don't think it's ours to master. I don't know that there's anything that we actually can master. I guess Oliver Berkman has exposed me to more ideas about how time is actually not really ours. And it kind of is more like sand moving through our fingertips. That doesn't mean that we're helpless and that we can't take action, but it's a little bit different idea, I think, here from what Rabbi Soloveitchik is sharing in this particular Haggadah from the Passover Seder. I do think retrospection, anticipation, and appreciation are all beautiful and important and are perhaps more wrapped up in each other in a continuum than we might imagine. So I guess it does fit with my teaching about time in some ways and not in others, I would say.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. So we might maybe have time for one more question. See a question here from Ricky, the yin-yang concept of tender energy versus fierce energy. Are there similar to concern? Are you familiar with those concepts, Susan?
A little bit, but Rebecca, I'm happy to weigh in or if you want to weigh in, but I have lots of thoughts on that.
I'm not so familiar with those concepts.
I would just say I'm tangentially, I'm not super immersed, but I would say that things came to mind. I think that this balancing of these sfirot is one of them, right? So chesed could be viewed as a tender energy, right? That's how we show up with tenderness and love in the world. And fear, there is a fierceness to gevura. There's a fierceness. There's a boundary. There's a fierceness in saying I'm going to focus on this, and that does mean releasing this. That is really, really hard. So I don't know that these two mystical sefirot came to mind for me, of the yin and yang, examples that Ricky offered. How about you, Rebecca? Anything else that came to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind for me is how I think Judaism in general, Jewish practice in general, is such a holistic enterprise, and that's reflected in so many of our containers and structures for practice, including the Tree of Life. And so much richness, relationships, but in how they balance, and how alive they are, really in relationship more so, I think, than in isolation. So this Omer journey is this opportunity to really dig in deep with relationships. And Rabbi Susan for bringing us into the spirit of Gevura Shebechesed today. Really wonderful to be in this Omer time together through mindfulness practice. And yeah, just thank you again. And thank you again to everyone. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow and continue on this Omer journey.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Rachel.